There are 11 tiny house villages in Seattle. And overall, last year, LIHI alone, we housed and sheltered 1,600 adults and children. And so it is a phenomenal, it's not just a small program.
Well, that is Sharon Lee right there, the founding executive director of the Low Income Housing Institute, or LIHI, a nonprofit housing organization. She's speaking out about the importance of tiny homes in our region when it comes to our homelessness crisis. So what's going to happen with these tiny homes under this new plan from the mayor to expand their footprint across Seattle? Where might new tiny home villages be built? How long do people stay in these tiny homes? What options do they have when they leave for more permanent housing? Well, plenty of questions to consider here on this Patrons First episode of Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm here with a very special guest. Will you please help me welcome Sharon Lee, who is the executive director of LIHI, onto the program. Sharon, thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
I'm glad to have you with us, and I know there's a lot to talk about here, so we're going to get to it in just a second. But a big thanks also to all of our patrons out there. Britt, Mark, thank you for your input over the past few weeks. I see you out there, and hey, folks, if you're not a patron, get on it. Please become one and support the show. You get podcasts like this first before anybody else, plus a cool decal. How about that? We even take in some of your questions about local politics, so find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon and support the show. A big thanks also for watching this podcast on Converge Media. The video version, I should say, of the show is on Converge most often Wednesday nights at 7. All right, we're going to get rolling with Right Here, Right Now. Well, Sharon, let's go big picture first. You are definitely a supporter of the mayor's plan here. She wants 500 shelter units by June, 1,000 in her first year, 4,000 over the course of her 4-year term. What is your assessment of this plan? Why do you support it? Let's start there.
Well, I'm thrilled. And this plan actually needs to happen. Why? Because we have, I think nationally, we have the 4th largest population of homeless individuals of any of the major cities. And so we have to do something. Standing still, just contemplating what can happen isn't going to work. So far, we have a tiny house village in every council district. Mm-hmm. We like the fact that the city council has said it's important that tiny house villages could be in every neighborhood. We like to make sure that tiny house villages are in places that are walkable, livable. You can go get on transit, you can go shopping, you can get services. And so we like the fact that the initial encampment ordinance that the city put together allows us in most zones. And currently, you can have up to 100 people in a village. Mm-hmm. And the council and the mayor in particular is pushing for some larger villages.
Yeah, can I talk about that with you? And this is an important part of it. More homes per encampment here. But can I touch on one other overarching issue here? Can you tell me about the role that LIHI would play in this? I know the mayor's asking for some funding for this, $17.5 million over the next couple months. Would that go to your organization, or how would this work here?
The financing can be very creative and very interesting, and you can also have some public and private partnerships. Okay. For example, in the past, we've had families and individuals, they've donated the cost of tiny houses. People have volunteered to build tiny houses. And then we also have property owners that will, in some cases, let us use their land. And there are some very, cost-effective ways to make sure that you can end up with a village which can house like 50 or 60 people. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you were trying to build a shelter, it would cost millions and millions of dollars, and it would take like 4 years, right? Yeah. So what's great about the villages is that you can build them in 3 to 6 months, depending on how complicated the utilities or setup would cost. So I think tiny house villages are very important because it's proven to work. Many people especially during COVID, they actually left shelters, and shelters actually shut down because many people can't or won't stay in a congregate shelter. Yep. It's very difficult to be in like one big space with people, and it's very hard to sleep with strangers, sure. Strangers next to you, right? So the tiny houses has taken off. Actually, Seattle has been a model national leader in tiny house villages. So this whole idea has taken off nationally. Yeah,
and let me break down that idea that you brought up earlier, this whole concept of what the mayor is trying to do. Mayor Wilson is talking about expanding the capacity of some of these tiny home villages to get some units online as quickly as possible. So moving from 100 residents to 150, for example, some as many as 250 in some locations. Those numbers, when you start putting them out there, some people might be thinking, whoa, is that a good idea? That's too many people. What do you say to people who are concerned about that, the expansion of some of these current tiny home villages and adding more people there?
Well, our largest village right now is 74 people. And actually, it's 74 tiny houses. So once you add couples, and of course, once you add couples, you're easily hitting 100. And so we actually have some property where we could expand adjacent, and we think that 150 would make a lot of sense.
Would it be too much of an impact on the neighborhood? I'm in the West Seattle area, just so you know, and I remember when Camp Second Chance, for example, there was an issue with people like camping outside of the actual tiny home village itself. Can you speak to that part of it too? Because I just want to ask some of the questions that I hear in the community here. What about that piece of it in terms of making sure that this is a safe place for people to be too?
I think one problem we're having is that there's so many people who are unsheltered who actually want to live in a tiny house. And so by expanding significantly the numbers, you're going to have fewer people feeling like they have to walk up and try to get in or camp nearby and hope to get in. So I think that makes a big difference. Since the demand is so high, adding more villages and frankly, even the 1,000 more or even 2,000 more, let's see, I think we've got 58% of the people are living unsheltered. So you've got 9,800 people in King County living unsheltered.
Okay.
So the demand is very high. Mm-hmm. Now, there's another issue, which is you're talking about, which is, let's say you have a village and people are camping outside, or people are doing, like, let's say, illegal activities or behavioral problems outside the village. That is something that the village staff can address. And also we need community service officers and we need the care teams and we need the, in some cases, the police department. Or if people are starting fires, we need the fire department. So it's a partnership. We need to make sure that the tiny house village is not isolated by itself, but it's having the support of the local public officials and local services to make sure that the village is successful.
And can you make sure you hit on that point? Because I think a lot of people think, oh, this tiny house, that sounds great, but there are some services available to people there, correct? And I mean, are people engaging with those services? Can you tell me about that interplay between where people are housed in these tiny home villages, for example, and the services that are available and who's actually using those services?
First, people should know that there is a code of conduct, and people who come to a tiny house village, they actually sit down with staff and the case manager, and they actually walk through the code of conduct. And the code of conduct is very clear about what you can do, what you cannot do. For instance, you cannot do any, illegal activities, and you're supposed to be judged on your behavior, not necessarily judge on your past, but judge on your current behavior, so that we are giving people like a second chance or third chance to receive essentially life-saving shelter. And then the case manager will do an individual service plan with each person. And the service plan, from what I can see, lots of people are participating because if you don't get your ID and if you don't cooperate, you won't get into housing or you won't get your income. Or you won't get an employment opportunity.
Right.
So we're seeing lots of people engaging with case manager and moving into housing.
Does a person have to be clean and sober to get into a tiny home village? I know a lot of people ask questions about that too. What's your stance on that? How does that work?
We meet people where they are. So we actually work with the outreach workers who refer people to the tiny house villages. So people have physical disabilities. Some people may have mental illness. Some people have developmental disabilities or even substance use disorder. So our staff, we have case management staff that's actually planted in the village. They have their offices in tiny houses. And then we have 24/7 staff around the clock. So if you need help, which people do with behavioral health, then you can get counseling and you can get treatment and you can get referrals and you can even get medically assisted treatment.
Have you heard that concern from people? Like, wait a minute, if you get housing, you should be clean and sober. I know that's a big issue for some folks out there, but I think you're coming from this position that Seattle and King County, at least a lot of people who work in the homelessness space are saying, is that we need to do housing first and then we're going to treat those problems. Can you help me with that argument back and forth? Because I know that's one that you have to talk about a lot too.
So what's very important is that it's very hard for people who are living on the street, living in their car, sleeping in a tent in a, sleeping bag to get treatment. They're basically struggling for survival. It doesn't work. So once they come into a village, you will see that their health, like their physical health, really improves. They might be malnutritioned when they were living outdoors.
Yeah.
And then you'll gradually see like they're so much better. They're feeling the anxiety of trying to find a place to sleep, the anxiety of not having food, and the hunger and actually danger of sleeping outdoors dissipates. So once they feel more comfortable and stable in a tiny house, then they can receive services. Now, because we also have a supply of permanent supportive housing, the idea is not that everyone is expected to get treated just because they enter a shelter, right? A shelter is a temporary location. A tiny house is not long-term housing.
Okay.
It's an emergency shelter, 24/7 enhanced shelter. The idea is that we do have permanent supportive housing. You cannot expect everyone to come into a village and get treated before they move into housing.
Okay.
And the permanent supportive housing actually, in many cases, will also have behavioral health, will also have case management service. So you can't say everyone should stay into a village, live in a village until they become clean and sober, and then they move into housing. It doesn't work that way. Because we have a pathway, we want to get people out of crisis, out of living unsheltered, into a tiny house village. And in some cases, people are staying in the village maybe 90 days. Majority of times, they may take up to like 6 months, right?
Okay.
And then depending on their needs and the availability, there's housing navigation. So the case managers will find housing, and it might be a variety of housing. It might not even be permanent supportive housing. It could be a shared house, a roommate situation. It could be reunite with family or friends. Frankly, it could be a group home. It could be assisted living. I mean, there's a variety. It could be transitional housing.
Yeah, there's a lot to consider there. There's one last piece I want to touch on with you before we take a break here. This idea of siting new shelter spaces. I know the mayor wants to set this up very quickly. That can always create some concern with neighbors. But I wanted to talk about just taking a snapshot on this. There was a recent presentation for a spot in West Seattle, the Glass-Yard Commons location, 7200 block of 2nd Avenue Southwest. I know this one's set up more for RVs. And so there's tiny homes, there's RVs, there's tents, whatever else. Can you talk about the plan there and just, I guess, the challenges in siting new spaces for these emergency shelters? Because I know that people in the neighborhoods have a lot of questions about this sometimes.
Yes, and I don't know if you remember, we had a RV safe parking at Inner Bay.
That's right.
And that turned out to be very successful. That was called Salmon Bay Village.
Yep. They ended up putting a pickleball court there.
That's right. That's right.
But anyway, it was successful while it was there.
We had a partner, which is University Heights, and they have a vehicle outreach program. And so they would do the outreach with the understanding that people who wanted to move into the RV safe lot to Salmon Bay would agree that they would eventually give up their RV, oftentimes because the RVs are in really bad shape. They could be full of mold, they could be fire traps. And in some cases, like some people are just having a hard time in terms of their own health conditions getting in and out of the RV, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea was that the RV safe lot would also include tiny houses. So if people could not live in the RV because the conditions were so bad, then they could move into a nice, clean, heated, tiny house. And that's what happened. And we actually had a high rate of success of people giving up their RV, moving into a tiny house, and then moving into housing.
Okay.
And so we're replicating that whole, the whole idea at Glass-Yard Commons.
Okay.
And so in terms of our outreach with the neighbors, we basically sent out letters to all the businesses and neighbors within 500 feet radius. And then we went door to door with the immediate businesses. And then my staff also contacted all the community leaders, stakeholders, business associations. And then we held a meeting at one of the churches. And the meeting actually went very well. We basically made available the information like the code of conduct, what questions are usually, frequently asked questions.
Right.
And of course, one big question was, what are you going to do with the RVs, right? Are you going to let someone else live in it or what? So we actually spend money, like serious dollars, destroying the RV so that they would not circulate on the streets of Seattle.
I know there's a lot ahead with that story, but I want to move on to some other pieces here. Coming up in just a bit, folks, we're looking inside the numbers. How realistic is it that the city can stand up 500 emergency shelter units by June? That part of the story coming up on Now Hear This. Well, I talked with Mayor Katie Wilson recently about her plan to establish 500 new emergency shelter units by June. This was on City Inside Out on the Seattle Channel. There was some concern from City Council Central staff about this. They're saying the mayor likely won't reach that goal due to several concerns that we've discussed in past weeks on this podcast. Here's how the mayor responded to that critique.
We're putting big numbers out in terms of units, but I really don't think that the number of shelter units is the most important metric. Okay. What I really want to do is dramatically decrease unsheltered homelessness in our city, because we know that the number of people who are sleeping unsheltered on our streets without a home and without even shelter is astronomical. Thousands of people. Our rates are much higher than even our peer cities across the country. And so
in terms of who's homelessness,
absolutely. Right. Yeah. And so we're really looking at tackling that problem at scale, and we're doing the things we need to get there.
Okay, so Sharon, level with me. Is Seattle going to reach this number of 500 new units by June? Even the mayor seemed a little doubtful with me, and I wanted to get your take on that.
Well, I think the goal is wonderful and tremendous, and I just want to show you what we've been doing. Mm-hmm. So in January, we opened up a new tiny house village in Lake City. Last month, we opened up a new tiny house village in Tukwila with a church by the side of the road. And then we're going to open up the Glasyard Commons, and then we're going to open up a new village on Capitol Hill, and then we're going to open up another village in South Seattle. I mean, we are also looking at 4 other sites that are possible. Now, as to whether they're all going to total 500 by June with our partners and other nonprofits, it probably will be a stretch. But maybe we should have started earlier, right?
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
If we had started earlier, the $17.5 million that the mayor currently has was found quicker. Right?
Yeah. Could find that money quicker. Okay.
But I'm very optimistic. I think the response from council was really tremendous. The council even indicated, maybe there should be 2 villages for families with children.
Sure.
Maybe there should
They're talking about more, right, above and beyond. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Maybe there should be a village for people in recovery. Yeah. I mean, I think that's tremendous, because we really should look at the diversity of people where tiny house villages really make it possible for people who feel like this makes sense, that they want to live in a community, right? It's all about community.
And I don't want to put too fine a point on this number, but because I get it. The mayor's logic is it's not about the number of units. It's more about showing the city can act fast, can act decisively on this. And yet, if that metric isn't hit, I just can't help but think there's going to be the headlines out there. In June, mayor said 500. That's not happening. What happens to public trust, I guess, which you really need for this effort to happen, if that metric isn't reached?
Well, I think it's going to be reached. It may not be reached exactly in June, right? Mm-hmm. But I believe it's going to be reached. Okay. I'll give you an example that we never experienced before. My construction manager actually had a meeting, and every single department was there. City Light, we have SDCIU, we had the fire department, we had the police, we had, just to go over the design on one village. Now, usually what would have to happen is that you would have to start with SDCI with a permit, and then you would later have to make an appointment, and then you would have to then later get another utility out there. This happened last week, where we were designing one village, and basically the mayor directed her entire cabinet to get every department that's going to be affected at the table to make comments to make this village happen. It was actually very refreshing.
Well, I hear what you're saying. It feels like this dialogue is changing. But I guess in looking at what the council is saying about this too, I hear the support, but at the same time, just to add some perspective here, Sharon, I've also heard this concern that, okay, we've got people staying in these tiny homes for 90 days, let's say, or maybe a little bit longer. But when they do get out of these tiny homes, where are they going? Is there enough supportive housing out there to take in everybody who needs help? And I don't know if the answer is yes on that in terms of the amount of housing that's needed on the other side of that tiny home experience.
Well, within Seattle-King County, there is around 6,000 units of permanent supportive housing.
Okay.
And I think the new housing, DSC is building a new 120 unit that's going to be opening up. Mm-hmm. We're opening up 90 units of housing for seniors, of which 75% will include previously homeless seniors, right? Mm-hmm. So even though the production of permanent supportive housing maybe has slowed down,
Yeah.
it's still continuing.
Okay.
And that's the battle we're facing. We need not just the capital, like capital funds from Jumpstart, capital funds from the housing levy, but we also need the operating support. And I think that's the issue with the federal budget as to whether, we can continue to grow significantly or whether we're going to have to find some different ways of financing permanent supportive housing.
And you are going down the exact path I want to go. Coming up, folks, a look ahead at the future of our region's response to homelessness, especially up against some of these challenges, the changes in federal funding that Sharon's talking about. That part of the story coming up on What's Next. Sharon, let's keep talking about this because I've been talking to a whole bunch of people in the housing and homelessness policy area about what's going to happen this year. We've got some much needed funding from the housing and urban development folks at the federal level here that is in question because the Trump administration is not supportive of this housing first model that Seattle and King County use. They want treatment first as a requirement for housing. They want people to have to make sure they're working towards employment in some cases specifically to get housing. And I'm looking at this and I'm seeing this could affect about $40 million in federal funding. Keep talking to me about this. How is this going to play out in our region? What have you heard? What do you know?
Well, one thing that we were very surprised to find out in terms of the whole housing landscape is that Senator Patty Murray really delivered for us this year. Basically, the Trump administration budget was going to strip out housing, including housing for seniors, the home program, CDBG, Continuum of Care, National Housing Trust Fund, all these programs, right? And Senator Murray, because of her powerful influence and position, was able to actually increase funding for HUD, increase funding for these critical programs.
Okay.
So we are so lucky to be here. And as a matter of fact, Senator Murray actually, I think, funded in terms of like putting into the congressional federal budget. She put in like 8 requests for capital for housing for community groups. That has made a huge difference. In terms of the cuts, as you see, we have to fight on the legal end. The idea that you can like all of a sudden change midstream the whole criteria of what the program is about and single-handedly like cut off permanent supportive housing operating funds is outrageous. So I think both the state and the city and the county, we're all facing that. What are we going to do? But it hasn't happened yet, right?
Okay.
Because of the advocacy and because everyone knows that this is so important. We have to keep the operating funds.
Yeah, is it a situation where I don't know when we'd actually see this? Would it be sometime this fall when the other shoe would drop here and we'd really kind of figure out how this is going to affect us, Sharon, in terms of those dollars coming in to impact local budgets? What do you know about that?
Well, I think we're still waiting for some of the legal challenges to be resolved.
Yeah.
But you will see again, President Trump just proposed his budget for the next federal fiscal year. Yeah. And again, he's doing drastic cuts in all the housing programs that are so vital.
That's a big concern. Well, Sharon, let me start to wrap this up with you here. I did want to talk about what progress you're expecting to see over this next year as Mayor Wilson's plans go into effect in terms of what's happening at the federal level. What are you seeing? What does your crystal ball tell you in terms of our homelessness crisis and where it's going to be by this fall, for example? Because I know the last point in time count, we're talking about 16,000 plus, and this was in 2024. I'm talking about those numbers. Is that number going to improve, or where are we headed here? Take me big picture again, please.
Well, I really believe if the mayor and the council, and actually you saw that Executive Gurmai has also made a commitment to stand up 500 shelter beds or housing units in 500 days. So I think if both those things happen, which I feel very good about, I think it will make a huge dent in the unsheltered homeless population.
And are there any other metrics you're keeping your eye on in terms of what's next here? I know the dollars are always a piece of it. Is there, in terms of the public sentiment that you're hearing from? Because when the mayor was talking about this, she said this is kind of an all hands on deck kind of a moment. Is this movement to really treat homelessness like an emergency? Is it getting that groundswell of support it needs? What are you seeing?
Well, I think when you look at the citizens of Seattle, they've been so supportive for voting to renew the housing levy.
Sure, right, okay.
They're also been big support of voting to renew the Vet and Human Services levy. And now County Executive Gramai is thinking of a county-wide housing levy.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think we're so far behind just because of the affordability issues.
Yeah.
And so if affordability and, housing and homelessness, addressing those are like top priorities,
Yeah.
then we need to look at the city providing more jumpstart funds right now.
Yeah.
As you know, this part of the jumpstart funds, majority was supposed to go for housing.
Right.
And then a big part of it got diverted into balancing the city budget.
Yeah.
So
right.
I think Mayor Wilson has an opportunity to say, okay, the jumpstart funds should be, let's claw back some of that money and use it for the intended purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, there was one last question I forgot to ask earlier, Sharon. I know that tiny home villages, they've done a lot of good. I know that it can raise concerns from people, too, who are saying this isn't a good enough place for people to live. You're warehousing these people who are homeless and putting them off in a corner or whatever else. How do you respond to that about these tiny home villages that I know are very important to you, but I know a lot of people, at least on the outside, are saying this isn't the right way to treat people who are homeless. How do you reckon with that challenge?
Well, we know that a tiny house village is far superior than a tent and far superior than living in a dormitory or getting a bunk bed.
Yeah,
with,
you can lock your own door on it, etc. Right.
Yeah, I mean, our tiny house villages actually at this point have heat, they have air conditioning, they're insulated, they're secure, they're warm, they're fully furnished. And you have like the kitchen, you have showers, you have laundry, you have case management. You have like a little village. It's like the old days of family camp, right?
Sure.
Your family would live in a little lean-to, and then you have all this like outdoor space. And so I think it's actually the preferred type of shelter arrangement. And the idea is not that it be permanent, that it be temporary. And so I think the critics, what do the critics have to offer? Do they think we should, like build like brick and mortar shelters all over the place?
Right. No, I hear exactly what you're saying.
And then the other
yes,
thing,
please.
Or do they think people should continue living in their cars? There's
Right.
so many people living, like families living in cars.
Yeah. So much ahead here with this, Sharon. I do need to wrap up with you. Any final thoughts as we finish this off in terms of your plans for the months ahead and what you're expecting to see out of the mayor's plan?
Well, we think that the Office of Housing and the city's Human Service Department, we have to address both the construction of new housing, the preservation of affordable housing, and shelters. We can't just pick one or the other. We can't have, that's like mindless for people to keep saying housing is more important than shelter, or shelter is more important than housing, right?
Yep.
You have to do both, especially if people are, actually, I couldn't believe it. We had like hundreds of people dying on the streets from homelessness, right? I mean, that is like, I think last year, 264 men and women died living on the streets from overdose, from violence, from exposure.
Yeah.
Right? Every time it gets cold, someone could die from exposure.
Yeah.
I mean, how humane is that?
Shoot, I know there's always so much more we can talk about here, but Sharon, I do need to wrap up with you. I just want to say thank you very much. This is Sharon Lee, founding executive director of the Low Income Housing Institute. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
You got it, Sharon. And thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Become a patron by checking out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Pledge $5 a month or more, and thank you for the help. Great to have you listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you tune in. Thank you so much. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.